Welcome back to Social Psychology. I'm your professor, Ryan Keith. And in this video, I want to talk about a couple of the less obvious ways in which we are prodded into engaging in aggressive and violent behavior. There are a lot of really obvious reasons that we might engage in aggressive behavior that's intended to harm others. And what can be obvious is some of the stuff that we're surrounded by now. For example, a number of lawmakers are expecting spikes in violent crime, especially domestic violence, because people are trapped together and they're frustrated and tired of dealing with each other. In this way, we know that annoyance and aggravation can spur people to engaging in violent behavior. If you have ever had to be in close proximity, like on a long road trip with a sibling or a cousin, this is not a big surprise to you. We also know that things like it being hot outside, making people uncomfortable, can cause them to engage in aggression, as well as stuff like being hungry or tired. None of this is surprising. But what about the less obvious things, the longer term things, the culture things? This is where I want to focus in our video today. There are a couple of points when it comes to culture I want to talk about in particular. The first is the role of a specific kind of culture, the culture of honor in violent behavior. And the second is the role of easily viewable violence in our culture. When I talk about the culture of honor, I'm talking about the kind of culture that tends to produce people who are particularly reactive to perceived threats. This is the kind of culture that spurs generations long feuds like those in our popular culture, like the Hatfields and McCoys. Feuds are the kind of fights that start between two families and then they go on so long that the people between the families continue to fight, even though they don't remember what the initial incident was that caused it. One of my favorite examples of a generations long feud comes from the song Decoration Day by the Drive By Truckers. It's a fantastic song written by Jason Isbell, and it's really cool, right? And it's about violence and culture of honor and being stuck in a conflict that you don't understand how it started. But you keep engaging in these fights because you continue to feel wronged. You lash out at the other party, they feel wronged, and they lash back out at you. So, how come certain cultures, like those of the mountains of West Virginia, the people who live in the mountains of West Virginia, why do these cultures produce these kinds of people? Well, first of all, we do tend to see a culture of honor emerge in particular regions. A study performed at Stanford University in the 20th century tended to show that people from the southern United States, especially the Appalachian region, so think like North Georgia, North Carolina, West Virginia, stuff like that, that people in this region of the United States were more reactive to perceived threats. When asked to come down to the psychology laboratory to take part in what they thought was a stress test, they had to pass through a narrow hallway stacked up with boxes hardly fit through. And as they passed through, they would bump into someone else who'd shove past them. And as the person shoved past them, would mutter something under their breath, something insulting. And what they found was that men in particular who came from these regions, like this Appalachian region in the United States, they had elevated heart rates, they were sweating more, they even gave a firmer handshake than women or people not from these regions. It was like there was something about feeling insulted that they felt like they really had to lash back at. So it's understandable. We see lots of cultural values, whether they're values like collectivism or individualism, values like thriftiness or a willingness to spend lots of money. Cultural values like looking out for your neighbor or looking out for yourself. Like these are not surprising things, and a reactivity to perceived threats. Like it would make sense that that could get passed along in culture also. But why in Appalachia? Your book talks about this a little bit, though not in a really great depth. And one of the possible explanations for it is that this same culture of honor is seen not just in the Appalachian Mountains, but also in the Scottish Highlands. And the reason we draw this connection between the Appalachian Mountains and the Scottish Highlands is that the Appalachian region was settled by people who originally came from the Highlands, and that both of these cultures are centered around agriculture, but not an agriculture of large crops like what you might see in Virginia or Alabama or even here in Florida, but rather around the raising of livestock. And why this matters is to think about like what can happen to ruin your livelihood. While raising crops, you can have a drought or a rainy season or cicadas that would come through and destroy everything. Other people would have a hard time wrecking all of your corn. Think about what it would take for someone to come in and take all of your corn, right? If you live in Iowa, you can be a pretty good neighbor because if somebody comes over, they're not going to be able to take off with all of your wheat or corn or potatoes. But if your entire livelihood is based on your care for hundreds or thousands of sheep, for example, all it really takes is a couple of guys on horses with a dog to take absolutely everything that you own. And as a result, it pays to be careful and suspicious and insular and to respond to perceived threats really, really strongly to keep everyone away who might be a possible threat to you. It's funny to think that our likelihood to get in arguments and get in fights and respond strongly to perceived threats might go back hundreds or thousands of years and have something to do with the livelihood that our great 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 grandparents engaged in and nothing to do with us. But this is exactly how invisible cultural transmission works. Another cultural element uh, has to do with our being inundated with violence, which is a funny thing. Robert Sapolsky talks in a TED talk that I assigned to you guys about some of the complex relationships that we have with violence. That I might be a fan of gun control, I might be a personal pacifist, but love playing violent video games or paintball or laser tag. How can that be, right? And it's because even though on a cognitive level I understand that violence is bad, there's something fun about the competitive nature of it, that there are these things we engage in that are rewarding even as they're violent. And we may feel like we understand that video games or violent movies are different from reality. But as Albert Bandura, the developmental psychologist who first proposed social learning theory, showed us with his Bobo doll experiment, um, we very quickly translate the behavior that we see in fiction to our own behavior. In his experiment, and I'm going to try to go ahead and upload a short video on it here. In his experiment, Albert Bandura showed not even particularly young children, we're talking about like elementary school children, a video of an adult engaging violently or non-violently with what he called a Bobo doll, which is this inflatable doll that if you push it, it falls over and stands back up. It's this kind of horrifying looking clown, right? And what he found is that when children viewed not the passive video, but the violent, aggressive video, these children not only showed the exact behavior that the adults did, picking up the doll and throwing it in the same way, knocking it over, hitting it in exactly the same way adults did, but they were more likely to build on those behaviors and elaborate them and create all new aggressive, violent ways to interact with the Bobo doll. At the time, the theory was that watching aggression, like watching a violent cowboy movie or mobster movie or samurai movie or superhero movie, would in some way be cathartic. You get out your own violent tendencies by watching someone else do it. But it seems like that's not the case, that this seems to kindle our own aggressive behavior. This doesn't mean that if you go watch a violent movie now, that you're going to be a violent person immediately after. After all, you're a grown adult. But when you're really young, you have a harder time drawing a line between what's false and what's real. And I mean, even now, you might watch a television show and know that it's fake. But at the same time, the bad news bias, as it predicts, right? The stuff that we see in media influences in the back of our minds implicitly what we expect. You may know that a romantic comedy is not a realistic thing, but at the same time, you may have particular expectations about what Valentine's Day should be like, or what your wedding should be like, or what your honeymoon should be like, or what courtship should be like based on the stuff. Even if you know it's not really real, it would be nice for it to be. These things sit in the back of our minds, and we tend to see that the more violent somebody engages with, the more violent behavior tends to be predicted. Of course, a much stronger predictor than just that, what kind of violent media they engage with, is what kind of violence people are surrounded by. People who grow up in houses with not just domestic violence or I guess domestic violence or sexual abuse or partner abuse or child abuse, even people who just grow up in households where they're more likely to engage with corporal punishment. In other words, if you grew up in a household where you were spanked, you're more likely to engage in violent and aggressive behavior. There are a lot of reasons why these relationships might exist, and not all of them are causal, but it is a thing to keep in mind that in a lot of indirect, implicit, almost invisible ways, the violence and aggression and messaging around us can lead us to feel like certain kinds of solutions are the ones that are more acceptable. That not just when we're thinking critically about how we should deal with a problem, but when we're in a situation where aggression is the most likely answer for us to turn to, when we're tired, when we're hungry, when we're irritated, when we are frustrated, when we feel threatened or provoked, when we're panicked and not thinking straight. We fall back on these default behaviors, much like what we talked about last week and the week before. We fall back on these default behaviors, the ones that were ingrained in us back when we were 3, 4, 5 years old, reacting the way that we saw people react in movie and televisions, even in our own homes. So, whether we choose aggression or not, violence or not, it's not just our fault. It's not just what's happening in the moment either. It's not just what's obvious. It's all this nearly invisible stuff. If you guys want to talk more about the nearly invisible determinants of behavior, of course, you can reach out to me during office hours. You can hit me up at officehours.page.link/meet to talk on Hangouts, or you can text or call me pretty much anytime at 352-327-8259. I might not be able to pick up or respond right away, but I'll hit you up as soon as I can. So that's that. Let me know if you have any questions or need anything else. I'll look forward to talking to you guys more about aggression, but also maybe some better stuff here in the coming weeks. I'm your Professor Ryan Keefe, and this is Social Psychology.